All right, let's go ahead and get this kicked off. Welcome, everyone, to our session today on BAS in converged IT and OT environments. We'll be talking today about incorporating BAS to help solve some of those visibility and validation issues as IT and OT network environments are coming together. My name is Patrick Kennedy. I am a security evangelist with SafeBreach, and I am joined today by Jay Bivens, one of our security engineers who has the really great job of talking to customers and prospects all day about issues just like this, and has a lot of real-world experience with the types of issues that folks are dealing with in this area. A couple of housekeeping issues. We will be recording the session, and it will be available on demand if you want to share it with your peers and colleagues. It'll be available on the SafeBreach site and under the resources tab within just a day or two. So please definitely do look for that. In terms of questions, we will leave some time at the end for your questions. If you see the Q&A button on your Zoom console, feel free to enter your questions there. And as I said, we'll leave some time at the end for that. We'll be talking about an overview of what's happening in the IT/OT security market. We'll be talking about details on integrating BAS into your OT environment and what that looks like from an architectural point of view. We'll be going through a couple of case studies to illustrate the types of challenges that we're seeing enterprises dealing with and how we can help in addressing those challenges. And then, as I said, we'll take questions. So a couple of points to set some context in terms of what's driving some of the challenges that we'll be talking about. So while OT security incidents were comparatively rare 10 years ago, research is indicating that they're actually quite common today. Virtually every industrial asset owner has experienced some kind of security incident in their OT environment in the last year. A recent survey indicated that was as high as 94%. One of the reasons that may be is that while OT security practices have matured over the past 5 years or so, it still doesn't get the same focus as IT networks. In a different survey, 80% of industrial organizations indicated that they only run a security assessment on their OT environment once a year or less. Now, as a breach and attack simulation platform provider, obviously we see that as a huge problem and advocate for more frequent, if not continuous, assessments. And that's one of the benefits that a BAS platform can bring. While the media tends to hype up specialized OT attacks using sophisticated kind of custom-built software and attacking specialized equipment in the electrical grid and things like that, the reality is the majority of OT attacks are attacking assets or devices on the network running commercial operating systems like Windows and Linux and so forth. And so the servers and workstations and HMIs that are running commercial operating systems tend to be the top 3 control system assets that are at greatest risk of compromise. So it's not just about attacking a PLC with a custom-built payload developed especially for a very sophisticated attack. The majority of these attacks are attacking the same types of hardware and operating environments that you see in IT attacks. And that becomes relevant as you start thinking about IT and OT defense as kind of two pieces of the same puzzle. So in terms of this risk landscape, or this threat landscape, we see the factors driving it really in kind of three main pillars. First, you've got the architectural design. You've got the network environment that historically was insecure by design. You had flat networks with very weak encryption, if any at all. You had ICS protocols that were just not designed with security in mind. Now, these things have gotten better over time, but there's still a lot of legacy technology out there. So the OT environment in general is still not built with security as a primary design consideration. These networks are now increasingly connected between the IT and OT networks. You're sharing data from the shop floor to the executive suite as you're tracking production KPIs and so forth, and connected to an ecosystem of vendors through your supply chain. And then you've got the threat landscape that continues to evolve. And as I said, the types of attacks are targeting very commonly used operating systems and hardware. The level of knowledge required to attack an OT network is comparatively low to those specialized attacks that we saw 10 years or so ago. As a result of many of these attacks coming in through an IT network, you see industrial asset owners losing billions in production downtime and so forth because of spillover from, for example, a ransomware attack that originated in the IT network, spilled over into the OT environment, and has shut down engineering workstations and so forth. There are many examples of production lines that had to be shut down because of collateral damage or spillover from a ransomware attack. So that's just a little bit of context for how we see the trends that are driving this market. We'll shift gears a little bit, and I'll turn this over to Jay to talk about implementing or utilizing BAS platform within that environment. So over to you, Jay.
Thank you, Patrick. So first, I'm going to talk about validating IT and OT security controls with breach attack simulation. And probably about 4 years ago, I started to see customers running into situations where IT security was actually starting to interface with the OT groups. And there was a little bit of a disconnect, I think, initially, and I think it's gotten better over time. So ultimately, what I think we all want as practitioners is better protection and visibility in that OT environment, and essentially providing you that shop floor to the top floor visibility. And the key aspect that everybody is interested in, especially at the OT side, is protection of that production uptime. That is the key driver for everything they do, and that's why a lot of times when IT and OT security meshes together, there can be conflicts. And what we feel breach attack simulation does is it helps unify the IT and OT security groups, because we're starting to speak the same language in the sense that we are testing and remediating and reporting the same metrics up the business. And so this actually allows organizations to confidently transition or transform into digital from an OT perspective for those organizations that still have analog-based OT environments. We also help organizations identify supply chain exposures. But ultimately, what we want to do is make sure that we can increase the cooperation between the two groups, assuming there's not already a relationship there today. Patrick, if we could advance one. So as everybody can imagine, the vast majority of the attacks generally start at the IT side. There's definitely stories of OT devices that are publicly facing on the internet that might have been installed by a vendor, and they still exist out there today. But generally, right, many of the attacks are going to begin with some form of ingress attack, whether it's going to be your standard spear phishing or watering hole-based attack. Once adversaries get inside, they do exactly what you expect them to do, right? They're going to do reconnaissance. They're going to attempt to grab credentials off of the endpoints that they compromise. And then they're going to start to identify or vulnerable paths to that OT-based network. And a lot of times that might be jump servers, or it could be essentially gaps in firewall protection. So from there, essentially, once they get access to that OT environment, they're essentially going to leverage those previously compromised systems that they have, in addition with the credentials that they've accumulated, and essentially start to go after that OT security zone in that DMZ, which is generally going to be what some organizations refer as level 3.5. Next slide. So generally, when we talk about OT security, the #1 graphic that comes up is going to be that Purdue Architecture. And most organizations say, yes, we do Purdue Architecture, but everybody does things a little bit different. So if this diagram doesn't necessarily represent exactly how you guys are laid out at the operational technology standpoint, it's going to be something comparable to this. So generally, your level 4/5 is going to be your enterprise or your corporate network. The IT or OT DMZ is going to be that level 3.5. This is where folks are going to use things like the jump servers to go from the corporate enterprise network into that OT-based environment. And then levels 3 and below are essentially going to be things like engineering workstations or historians, which is essentially where those matrices and KPIs come from that Patrick talked about earlier. The human machine interfaces and things like SCADA networks. And then usually levels 1 and below are going to be areas where they are running custom operating systems or real-time operating systems that aren't necessarily going to be that standard IT enterprise security or general purpose OS. And so, Patrick, if you could advance one, I'll show how SafeBreach usually implements in these type of environments. So on levels 4 and 5, what we're essentially doing is deploying out to your standard enterprise desktops or laptop environments, enterprise servers, and maybe have network-based attack simulators on that enterprise network. And what we will typically do is install usually in 3 locations once we start talking about the OT-based environment. And when I say locations, I'm really talking about 3 different levels or systems. Patrick, I think we got a, okay. So essentially where we typically install is these 3 locations are going to be the jump server. So that might be a Linux-based system, or it could be a VDI environment where people are using something like Citrix to access that OT environment. And usually the second or third are going to be locations like engineering workstations or HMIs. And the reason for this, as Patrick laid out, we have general purpose operating systems typically deployed out on these systems. There's going to be security controls in these environments. And one thing you'll note is that we put the word clone next to it because most OT organizations, right, because this is OT-based systems, do not want it running on their production environment. And so what this allows SafeBreach to do is we can do attack simulations on things like the jump host to see how the security controls are on that VDI or that Linux-based environment. If we're talking about the engineering workstations and HMIs, of course, we can also validate those particular security controls at those individual systems. And the reason this is important is there might be different security profiles on those endpoints that might be different than the corporate enterprise environment. But the other thing to note is if you look on the left-hand side where we had the firewall icons, and you can see it behind the firewall at the very top, you'll notice that we have that SafeBreach icon on top of those firewalls. Now, technically, we're not actually installing on those firewalls, but what we're doing is we have the ability to go from that HMI clone to the workstation clone, or ultimately to that jump server host, and actually validate the firewall configurations that are happening between the different levels in this IT/OT environment. Now, on the right-hand side, and of course, I won't read this to everybody, but essentially what we have laid out on the right-hand side is what we're essentially validating and verifying in that environment between the different levels. And the one thing to note here, and this is really important for OT-based environments, is what is unacceptable generally in OT environments is essentially going out and doing a scan or an aggressive scan inside of the environment. Because generally, because these systems were not designed for security right out of the gates, they could be somewhat temperamental. So at SafeBreach, what we do is we actually will attack from a SafeBreach system to another SafeBreach system. And so in this example, we would go from HMI clone to maybe engineering workstation clone, or engineering workstation clone to jump server. And we can monitor the interactions between those systems to identify what holes might be opened up in the firewall. And that's important because a lot of times when you start getting into that OT environment, those firewalls are going to be managed usually by one of two groups. It could be the OT group, and they're essentially telling IT security that everything is all clear on the Western Front and that everything is configured correctly. Or I have seen in certain environments for vendors that provide turnkey OT environments where that vendor might actually manage those firewalls. And so this gives IT security organizations the ability to validate that what the OT or the third-party vendors are providing is exactly what they're delivering as it relates to the network-based security. I'll pause for a second. Is there any Q&As at the moment, Patrick? Or?
There is one question. You may have addressed this, but I'll bring it up in case there's anything else you want to add. So questions are you seeing a demand for lateral movement testing in a less flat environment, e.g. the Purdue model?
Yes. Matter of fact, a lot of times, and I actually have a use case slide that I'm going to cover in a little bit, but a lot of times there are security controls, and usually the security controls that live in an OT environment are going to be solutions like Armis Security or Dragos. Clarity would be another one. And Nozomi is a fourth one that I can think of right off the top of my head. A lot of times those security controls in those environments are actually looking at the data as it traverses the different zones or as it accesses the OT systems at the lower levels. So having the ability to monitor if things like lateral movement, where binary files for industrial control systems are transitioning through the firewalls to the different levels, is definitely an area that folks should be monitoring on the OT security side. Next slide. So some of the use cases. I think we have two that we're going to cover today. And these are things that I see quite often. The first one is talking about how attacks make it into the environment. And of course, the number one way that attacks get into any environment today is pretty much spear-phishing. So having the ability for attackers to identify the individual, so that might be an OT individual or somebody that is affiliated with OT-based networks. And they essentially will go out and establish a campaign. The goal is obviously to get individuals to click on an embedded link inside of that particular email that they're sending, and ultimately have an unattributable command and control communications back to a CNC-based server. But the challenge here is when you start thinking of living off the land tools or utilities. So what seems to be very popular today is that when attackers get on an endpoint, it's not necessarily to pull their own tools or utilities into the environment, but rather to use the utilities that are built into the operating system. So if we're talking about a Windows system, right, we might be talking about the net command. or any of the associated utilities that are built in. PowerShell, of course, comes to mind as well. And the challenge there is when we start thinking about utilities that are built into the operating system is those are utilities that can't necessarily be blocked. In some situations, you can have a group policy or some sort of PAN-based utility that you can maybe restrict who can run those utilities and what utilities they can and can't run. But generally speaking, these utilities are going to live inside of the environment by default. And the question is how do you detect when living off the land is actually taking place in your environment? And breach attack simulation, when we run through these attack simulations, the number one and number two areas that I see where prevention is not taking place is going to be in the MITRE discovery tactic and also the MITRE collection tactic. So that's essentially where they're going out and trying to discover what's inside of the environment, whether it's IT or OT. And of course, collection is where they're going to try to grab information files. So if we're talking about the OT side, maybe there's some sort of ladder logic. If some organization is making chemicals, maybe they want to be able to grab certain files as it relates to some of the authentication. And so they're going to try to collect those files up. And so we want to be able to identify what security controls can prevent, and then what security controls aren't preventing today as it relates to living off the land. And then what SafeBreach can do is we can show you how you prevented the attacks, but we can also show you how the logging took place inside of that environment, which allows SOCs to go out and generate detections. Next slide. And for the second case study, talking about malware that essentially was designed to disable critical infrastructure. And so a couple of examples that we had highlighted was based on Windows HMIs or human machine interfaces. There was Whispergate and there was hermetic malware. And essentially what these were designed to do was essentially manipulate that MBR, the master boot record, to render that device inoperable. And so earlier, a Q&A came up talking about should we be monitoring lateral movement as it relates to the different levels within the Purdue model. And of course, the answer is absolutely yes, right? Having that visibility. And so this use case talks about a couple different points, which is validating the span port configuration. I've had a long career of working at security controls, which are working off of span ports. And so for those folks that might not be on the networking side, a span port essentially takes a copy of the traffic and sends it to the security control. So this would be that Armis Security or the Dragos or Nozomi utilities that might be in that OT environment. And it's not uncommon that span ports get unconfigured. So let's say a network engineer might go into the environment and reutilize that span port to monitor network traffic, and it might not get set up again. It's also not uncommon that you might only be getting unidirectional traffic. So maybe RX or TX, but not both RX and TX, which definitely hurts the visibility. So by going through and using breach attack simulation, you can actually validate whether or not that span port is functioning properly based off the detections that you might get. So we talk about running the network-based attacks. So segmentation is very relevant, I think, in any OT environment, and definitely in the Purdue model. So validating those layer 2 and layer 4 controls between the HMIs and the engineering workstations or the jump host, and making sure that they're functioning the way that you intended. And then the third is essentially validating that the OT security control that is looking at the copy of the traffic from that span port has the ability to identify those simulated attacks, which in this case would be the transfer of ICS-specific malware between the different levels or the different zones inside of the environment. And so down towards the bottom right, we start talking about the access control list and how it applies to not only the firewalls, but access controls can also apply, going back to the earlier statement on span ports, to make sure that the right traffic is making it to the security control. And then essentially highlighting the segmentation to see if there's any remediations that need to take place between the different levels themselves. Next slide.
Jay, we have a couple of questions that have come in. So rather than spending the time on the summary slide, I want to make sure that we do address these questions. I think both of them really, go back to the Purdue diagram. So I'll bring that up again. So first question, any other test being performed outside of network or host application on the clones?
So on the clones, we would have the ability to do write to disk functionality. We have the ability to do what we refer to as pre-execution. That's where we'll load malware into memory to see if the endpoint control can actually identify it. The clones would also have the ability to do that discovery to see what else it might be able to identify based off of the utilities that are built into the operating system itself. And also the ability for your security controls to identify the collection of data off of that individual system itself. And then I think the question basically said network transfers. So network transfers is definitely a part of that. So having the ability to participate or to pull that network transfer across the different levels. And probably the last thing to note is that while it's not necessarily a network transfer, you would have the ability to test the firewall configuration between the different clones themselves. So it could be as simplistic as the ability to do a scan from the HMI clone to the workstation clone to see what is available or operational between it. But we also have the ability to try or to attempt to exfiltrate data over different ports and protocols. And was there another question, Patrick?
No, that was it. That was it for that one. Thanks, Jay. And we are just about at the bottom of the hour, just about at the end of our time. So I do want to wrap up by thanking you all for joining us this morning and inviting you to schedule a demo. If you would like a more kind of personalized view of how we can integrate into your OT environment, email us at contact@safebreach.com. You can also go to the website. There's a button in the upper right-hand corner to contact us and schedule a demo. So we invite you to do that. And again, thank you very much for your time this morning. Have a great rest of the week.